Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by DevOps.com and content brought to you by PagerDuty. My name is Chris Riley. I'm a DevOps industry analyst at large. And before I hand it over to George, who's going to talk to us today about basically a framework of how you respond to and how you communicate, critical outages and issues with your application. Few housekeeping items. So you can hear and for a little bit see us, but we can't hear you. So if you have any questions in the GoToWebinar dialog, there's a question box. Submit your question there, and we will get to those during the Q&A section. We also have a giveaway in today's webinar. It's three $50 Amazon cards. We will be announcing the names for those and the winners of those after the Q&A. So make sure you hang out all the way to the end and find out if you're one of the winners. So I'm really excited for today's content. I think the content that George and team have put together that help build a framework for responding to critical disasters is really big. So George, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Well, hello. Let me also welcome you to today's webinar, The Perfect Storm, how we talk about disasters. So today we're going to cover how we talk about technical disasters when they occur. And this is a DevOps.com webinar, so you might be asking yourself how exactly this fits into the DevOps space. And I think a few important DevOps principles are things like cross-functional collaboration across teams, right? Breaking down communication barriers, understanding what other parts of your organization do, and incorporating expertise just beyond your own team, right, and what your own team normally does, and using that to create more holistic practices that produce better outcomes. So this process is applying lessons that we've learned on the technical side of most organizations and applying them in similar ways to traditionally non-technical and traditionally not on-call teams. So we have quite a bit of ground to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera now so we can get into things. Today we're going to do this by looking at the incident response practices that are developed and used by engineers and developers in our organizations. And then we're going to look at how those lessons apply and how they should be used by other parts of our organization, like marketing, sales, executive teams. We all deal with technical product outages or incidents, but every once in a great while, you'll have cascading system failure, or you'll have just the right necessary components come together or come apart to create a perfect storm of events that leads to a catastrophic failure. And when those hopefully rare moments occur, they can either catch us by surprise, or they can provide a really good opportunity to work cross-functionally across our entire company to mitigate the damage that occurs when those types of events happen. So a little bit about me, right? So again, my name is George Miranda, and I'm your host. I'm a community advocate at PagerDuty. PagerDuty is focused on managing real-time operational challenges, which is great because what that means is that I get to share things like the content of today's webinar. That's my job. So how awesome is that? I'm also a former EMT and a first responder. So planning for the unexpected is a bit of a personal hobby. I'm also a career-long infrastructure engineer. Like, I am the type of person that gets paged when something breaks, right? But throughout my career, I've also spanned multiple silos, and I've worked for parts of the organization like product, business development, product marketing, and even straight-up marketing, right? So I think when you put all of that background together, for me personally, it's been a perfect storm of a background that's been very useful in working with a diverse set of teams across PagerDuty to figure out our own company-wide response plans for disaster scenarios. Now, before we get into things, I'm going to warn you, today's webinar is intermediate to advanced level incident response content. But stick with me, and I promise that even if you're a beginner, there's really good stuff in here for you. So I'm going to share lessons learned and practical tips from my experience doing this at PagerDuty, so that hopefully you can use that to put together your own crisis communication response plan. So as we go through today's webinar, I encourage you to submit questions if you have them. We should have time at the end to cover all of them. And if you're watching this recording of the webinar at a later date, I encourage you to reach out to me via Twitter with any questions or comments you may have. I would love to chat with you about your own approach to crisis communications. So reach out to me at any time. Let's look at today's agenda. So first, we're going to start with some common definitions and terms, just so that we're all on the same page about what it is we're talking about. This is basically a very quick introduction to incident response basics, and more or less a call to action if you're not already practicing some of these things yet. And then we're going to look at that same incident response framework that we use for managing technical incidents and see how that applies to managing crisis communications incidents. When things go, terribly wrong on the technical side, you basically have to get ahead of a mound of questions and uncertainty that your customers will have, and that mound is coming right for you, right? So you need to get ahead of it. So we'll look at how to approach that through the lens of dealing with a catastrophic technical incident. Then we're going to drill down a bit to look at the mechanics of how a communications response plan spawns off of your technical incident response plan. And then we'll talk a little bit about the types of questions you should be asking before you start creating your own response plan. So things like how to create, how to practice, and how to refine those plans when you put them into play. And then I'll finish by introducing a couple of free vendor-agnostic step-by-step guides that you can use to help you build a process like this that is custom to your team. And then we'll talk about some next steps. So with that, I think we have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. In order to get started, we need to clearly define what we mean by a technical incident. There are several types of things that can go wrong in our digital infrastructure, right? And so some organizations might define this differently, but at PagerDuty, what we recommend is we have a very short, simple, no more than a sentence type definition, right? So that an incident is something that can be easily understood by everyone. So here on the screen, we have a working definition for an incident, and that's an incident is an unplanned disruption or degradation of service that is actively affecting your customer's ability to use the product. That's a pretty broad definition, right? And intentionally so. So a couple of things could fit in here, right? Everything from a typo in your documentation, right? That could fit this definition. Maybe your documentation says you should do this thing, and what your documentation is supposed to say is you shouldn't do this thing. And that would actively affect your user's ability to use the product, right? On the other end of the spectrum, we have things like a full service outage, right? Your website is down. That also fits this definition. So when we talk about incidents, I think we need to differentiate a little bit further. Incidents are classified either as minor incidents or major incidents. And a major incident is an incident where we require a coordinated response between teams. So sometimes, right, minor incidents, for example, can be handled by a single team, right? Maybe the owners of a particular service that's having trouble are able to deploy a fix and resolve the situation. That would be considered minor. But as soon as they need to involve another team, whether it's customer support or database administrators or anyone else, right, that's when we declare this to be a major incident and kick off a much larger response process. The coordination is key here, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But even that definition, right, like that still covers a pretty broad range of potential incidents. So we can still get more granular. And we also use severity levels to determine how impactful an incident is and what type of response it gets. Some organizations use severity levels like Sev 5 through Sev 1, right? Or they use priority levels like a P1 to a P5. Maybe you use something different. But what matters here isn't so much the label as it is that you have a clear categorization that mirrors how impactful an incident is to your users and to your business. But incidents aren't always very clearly understood when they start, right? So let's imagine that you're looking at a graph of traffic to your website, right? And you can typically determine severity based on how drastically your metrics are affected, right? So let's say as your website traffic drops, the severity increases. You'll usually reach a point where you've crossed some predefined target or watermark right? And as soon as that metric passes, then you automatically consider something a major incident. At PagerDuty, that's the difference between a SEV 3 and a SEV 2. But this might be different for your organization, right? And then in this example that we're looking at, right, things get even more dire and they go into a SEV 2 and then finally a SEV 1. And that's where we have the worst type of failure that we can have, right? Something catastrophic. So let's define that a little bit, right? What is a catastrophic failure? And I use that term to mean an incident so big that it's noticeable to a very wide swath of your users and potential prospects, and an incident that goes on for so long that it can cause material brand damage and erode market trust in your company, right? I think we all want to believe that catastrophes won't happen to us, but think back to that time when your favorite social media site was unavailable for a few hours and the ruckus that caused, right? Or when your developers couldn't save their work because your code repository was offline for half a day, right? How disruptive was that? Or what about that time that your infallible cloud provider, proved that they were fallible and had a major disruption and knocked out all sorts of companies offline, right? Did they think that would happen to them? And now if you look at the slide, right, now we have news articles that talk about, what sorts of failures you can expect from these things, because these catastrophes indeed do happen and they're damaging when they do. So let's break down what happens when we have catastrophic outages like this. So when technical incidents occur, right, it's critical that you have an incident response plan in place. So your teams have to know what's expected of them. Minor incidents, for example, like they might go into a support queue, and those incidents can be resolved during normal business hours. Whereas, something like a major incident probably requires an immediate response and a trained set of on-call responders that are on a rotating schedule to provide 24/7 coverage, right? So most organizations have something like this. But I think the first step in this journey is looking at how effective that response process is for you today. And I think the way that you do that is by looking at your mean time to recovery, right? When major incidents occur, how long does it take you to restore service? Is that measured in minutes? Do you measure that in hours? Or do you measure that in days, right? What happens in your organization today when a major incident occurs, right? Do you have a process that alerts the right responders at the right time that are needed for this particular event? Or, does your process maybe mean that, you just call everyone, right? Like wake up everyone, get them all on one big chaotic incident call bridge, right? And that's what I love to call the spray and pray approach, right? Which is you just get everyone on the line and surely one of them is going to know what to do, right? But usually what happens is, there are a lot of competing teams, there's a lot of confusion, and that approach only causes more problems than it solves. So before we go any further today, a base assumption here is that your organization has a very clear incident command structure, that you have a very functional and precise process for responding to these incidents today, and that your incidents have, clear categorizations, defined responder roles, and that you have an effective technical incident response process, right? So when a technical incident occurs, what you have is a very clear, organized way of bringing calm to the chaos that can happen when we respond to emergencies, right? That's the base assumption that we're going with. So if that does not sound like your organization today, then you need to take care of that bit first, right? So here's what you should do. Go to response.pagerduty.com, and what you're going to find there is a free-to-use, vendor-agnostic guide on how to structure an effective technical incident response process. And the incident response process that you'll find there is a framework for managing technical incidents, and all of that is based on the Incident Command System, or ICS for short. The Incident Command System isn't something that was invented at PagerDuty. ICS was actually developed after a series of devastating wildfires in Southern California in the 1970s. And what happened there is, thousands of firefighters from across a number of different agencies responded to that emergency. But when they did, they found it really difficult to work together, right? Each fire battalion knew how to fight fires individually and even, coordinate within the battalion. And even the smaller fire departments, right? They each knew what to do individually, but together, because they all worked differently, they lacked a common framework to work as a larger group. And so the short story here is that an interagency fire department group developed the incident command system, and now it's a national model for command structures in any major incident, right? ICS is used from everyone from local fire departments responding to a house fire to U.S. government agencies like FEMA responding to a big natural disaster. And the reason that happens is because ICS provides a standardized response system that everyone is familiar with, regardless of how they operate individually. And I really want to emphasize that. This is a framework that is useful for when you have various developers or various operational teams that don't normally work together, right? In a moment of crisis, you need a common framework for operating in a robust and proven way, right, that keeps the incident process moving along and resolves incidents effectively, right? And so at PagerDuty, what we've done is we've heavily modified the ICS framework to fit the needs of managing technical incidents. And notice that I said we resolve incidents effectively, and I didn't necessarily say we resolve them quickly. I think an important concept here is that the goal of a proper technical response system is that we handle the situation in a way that limits the damage and reduces recovery time and cost. And I think that's especially important when we consider mitigating reputational damage. So again, right, step one is if your current response process lacks these characteristics today, you need to address that first and foremost. So check out response.pagerduty.com, and I'll also highlight some additional training resources at the end of this presentation. So do that first. That's step one, right? Step two is come back to the rest of the content in this webinar. And I think, again, we dive into some more advanced topics from here. And then you'll get a little bit more out of that once you cross that bridge. But for now, we'll presume that your incident response process is structured similarly and works more or less according to the principles of the incident command system. So in case you haven't done step one yet, as a primer for the next part of the discussion, we'll quickly review what the command structure for a major incident looks like. There are several roles here, so don't let the graphic fool you. The structure is quite flexible and it scales up and it scales down very well. But in this comprehensive view, we can see that there are two layers that are critical for what comes next. In the command layer is what we call an incident commander. This is the person that's in charge during an incident, and they're one of the most important roles in the process. The incident commander, makes all decisions. All information flows up to them, right? What they say goes. But an important distinction here is that an incident commander doesn't resolve the incident themselves, right? They coordinate and they delegate tasks. They're more or less a conductor of the orchestra, right? They're not playing an instrument, which means that during a technical incident, the incident commander should not be looking at graphs or logging into servers, right? Their responsibility is to keep a big picture view of everything that's happening, act as a single source of truth and authority, and drive that incident to resolution. I'm going to go ahead and skip the rest of the command staff so that we can focus on the communications layer, because I want to talk about the customer liaison. So in an incident, a customer liaison provides customer updates during an incident about what's happening. So at PagerDuty, this is usually the person that updates our status page, right, and does some one-to-many customer communications on Twitter. But this role, somebody, whoever's acting as a customer liaison, they also keep a pulse on the customer impact of an incident by monitoring not only channels like Twitter, but also looking at support queues, right? Like, are people opening up tickets about this incident? How big is this impact? How much is being done, right? So I want to point out these roles because in a normal major incident, right, the kind of thing that's not a catastrophe, these two roles have pretty critical tasks to deal with. But in a catastrophic situation, some of the things that they do have to change a little bit. All right, great. Now we have enough background on how effective technical incident response works, and sort of what it looks like. So let's talk about catastrophe, right? So in technical terms, what is a catastrophe? I think my take from the years that I've spent in IT is that as an industry, we tend not to account for the worst case catastrophic scenario. And I think that happens for a couple of reasons. I think one, we spend a lot of time engineering resilient systems, and over time, like, we've certainly become much better at that. But I think as a result, because we have all these loosely coupled components, I think we tend to account for loosely coupled failures quite well, right? And it's also probably because, catastrophes are so rare, we spend very little time preparing for them. But what I mean by a catastrophe, again, right, is kind of the super big, super visible, multi-hour, total service outage that's going to make somebody write a news article about you, right? That's the thing that everyone thinks, or hopes won't happen to them, right? And I think that's an extreme example, but it makes the point. So for our purposes, I'll go ahead and further define catastrophe. So at PagerDuty, we started by defining it as this. A catastrophe is a critical issue causing continued unacceptable business impact, requiring larger company engagement. It happens when two things are true. One, there's an ongoing SEV1 condition, our highest severity level, that is actively affecting customers. And we also have very low confidence that this is going to be resolved within an hour, right? And you can define this threshold as needed for your organization. In fact, at PagerDuty, as we've developed this process, our metrics have become much, much more granular. But at a high level, what matters is that as a company, you decide what those thresholds are and that you communicate those to responders explicitly, right, so that they can be recognized when they occur. And I'll say this, right, catastrophic events, by definition, should be extremely rare. As a guideline, right, this is the kind of thing that should happen 0 to maybe 1 times per year, right? A catastrophe is not your average run-of-the-mill technical incident, right? It's not even the particularly bad ones. This is your extreme worst-case scenario, right? And if that's happening more than 0 to 1 times per year, then either your thresholds are defined a bit too low, or you have much bigger application infrastructures to address first. But again, right, catastrophic incidents are a very highly visible outage. They erode customer trust, and when that happens, it's critical to mitigate that damage and earn it back as best as possible. And the key to that is proactive communication and transparency with your customers to let people stay informed and to just be upfront about what's happening. So when a catastrophic technical incident occurs, at PagerDuty, we also consider that a crisis communications incident. This is a crisis that requires an additional level of proactive, cross-team, coordinated internal and external communication. And the goal of a crisis communications incident in this case is to do the following, right? You need to proactively prepare statements that are distributed internally to employees and stakeholders to brief them of the situation, right? You got to tell the company what's happening. Next, you need to prepare, properly vet, and distribute proactive updates to your strategic customers or partners or folks that you really need to protect your reputation with. And then you also need to be ready to respond to inbound inquiries, right? You need to prepare and approve media responses as appropriate. So you basically need to get ahead of the massive storm of questions and uncertainty that are headed your way. And to do that, what happens is that you effectively switch operations inside of your company from being in normal mode to being in emergency mode. Right? And what it means to go into emergency mode is that many of the typical day-to-day customer-facing activities that you would normally do get shut down. Right? Customer-facing teams get put on high alert, right? And you all start working together on mechanisms to help mitigate some of that trust erosion that's getting worse by the minute. All right, so let's get down to brass tacks, right? How does all of this work in practice? What actually happens? So switching company operations into emergency mode is not a process that you should take lightly. It's usually a heavy lift, and so you want to be very careful when approaching that, right? So what that means is that this entire response process starts with the decision to flip that switch and how that decision is made. So what we recommend is that you should have a technical member of your senior leadership team, or SLT, be on call at any given time, right? And so this is typically somebody like your CTO or head of product, VP of engineering, right, or other senior technical staff members. It should be a rotating on-call responsibility. And the responsibility of this technical SLT role is to help assess the situation, right, determine if this is a catastrophe indeed, and then to initiate the wider company response if this incident does in fact reach that level. At PagerDuty, whenever there's an ongoing Sev1 for the highest severity incident we can have, right, and responders being aware of what those explicit thresholds are for what constitutes a catastrophe, when it seems that an incident may be nearing those thresholds, an incident commander can alert the technical SLT member and request that they join the incident bridge. And so when they do, and once they come up to speed on the situation, it's the technical SLT member's responsibility to help gauge if this incident constitutes a catastrophe as defined by the company. But what I want to note is that in order to declare a catastrophe, both the technical SLT member and the incident commander must agree that this is a catastrophic event, right? And so I like the analogy I like to use is think of this like the process of launching a nuke, right? You need two keys at different ends of the room to be turned at the same time. And this is that same sort of safeguard, right? Declaring a catastrophe is, it's something to approach carefully. And so this act is what initiates a new crisis communications incident. So when a technical communications incident is initiated, a couple of key things happen, right? And so in this diagram, you'll notice that our technical SLT member is part of the operational roles, right? They had a specific function that they needed to assess. But when we realize that we've gone ahead and we've triggered this process, let's look at the mechanics of what unfolds. So the technical SLT member now becomes the designated spokesperson for this technical event, right? Their name is attached to emails or written communications. They create the drafts of what's being said, and they are essentially the public face for all related communication. So the technical SLT member leaves the technical incident call in order to join a new communications incident bridge, where they are going to be focused on resolving the communications crisis incident. The customer liaison is typically a staff member that's the technical subject matter expert, or usually someone like part of the support team. So what the customer liaison does is they will call in a backup. Our customer liaisons are typically on a primary and secondary on-call rotation. So the secondary customer liaison joins the technical incident call to take over the normal duties that a customer liaison would do. And the primary liaison then also leaves the technical incident call and joins the new incident bridge, also to work on resolving the crisis communications incident. So they participate on the call as a technical subject matter expert, right, to ensure technical accuracy in any of the communications that are going to be sent out. They also act as a conduit between the technical incident call and the communications incident call, but we're not going to get into that level of detail just yet. Next, you get a trained set of on-call communications incident responders to join the communications incident bridge, right? And so the roles are as follows. One, you need somebody from the growth side of the house, right, or outbound marketing. So the growth officer is responsible for managing marketing campaign operations. And this is somebody that should be familiar with your marketing automation platform, your paid social tool, your content publishing platform, and other outbound marketing tools that you have. So this role is responsible for halting all of those outbound activities that are actively telling your prospects how great your product is, because right now your product isn't working, right? And that's a bad first experience. So this person also should be somebody that can utilize tools like your CRM to do the work of actually delivering some of those customer communications. The social officer is responsible for monitoring all social channels that are relevant to your company. Right? So during a catastrophe, customers will try to reach out to you in various ways. Right? And so the primary goal of this role is to catch all of those social interactions, to respond to them, and to provide a pulse to the communications incident group that gauges how the current communication is being absorbed, right? Is it sufficient? Do we need to do more? I should also note that this role monitors not just external social channels, but internal social channels as well. So inside your company, right, this would be something like Slack or another centralized communication channel, right? Because you also need to be aware of whether or not your own employees are getting the right level of communication and whether or not they understand what's happening. We also have a media officer, right? This is typically a trained member of your corporate communications team. Right? And so this role is responsible for drafting and distributing any media-related communication. So, they respond to inbound inquiries from press or analysts, and, they might also work with PR agencies to manage a response if that's the appropriate thing to do. And more or less, right, this set becomes the operations group for your incident. You might identify additional needs for your organization, but at a minimum, these are the types of bases that you should have covered. Next, we introduced some corporate controls by way of an approval layer for all messaging that's generated by the operations group, right? Again, this is a very critical time for your company. So these roles are essentially a group of stakeholders that review all communications that are being generated and have approval authority over whether or not it can be released. So we start with a messaging officer, right? And this is somebody that's responsible for ensuring that communications have the right tone, that they are in the voice of your company, that they meet your corporate messaging guidelines. We have a legal officer. I think that one's pretty straightforward, right? They're responsible for reviewing any proposed communications and ensuring that they meet your corporate legal requirements. And then there's a spot for the executive leadership team, right? And so this is an on-call member of the ELT who responds to, or who is there to represent the interests of the company, right? The interests of the executive team and the interests of board members. So they have final say, or should have final say, over what can and cannot be said in outbound communication. So in practice, right, this is likely your CEO, but every role should have a backup in case they are not available, right? So this, again, should be a rotating responsibility among ELT members. You may also find yourself in a situation where multiple executives want a seat at the table, and that's fine. You may have additional roles here, but my practical advice is to try to avoid having too many cooks in any one kitchen. And then finally, we have the communications lead, right? And so this is a new incident group. And so this group, because there are a number of competing demands here, also needs its own conductor. Again, right, the role of the conductor is to conduct the orchestra, not play an instrument. They keep the incident moving along, follow the process, and make sure that this group is driving towards effective resolution of the incident. And so this is a rotation of individuals specifically trained on the communications incident response process, which is basically ICS, or crisis communication. And it's also important to note, right, that for a catastrophic technical incident, this entire working group rolls up to the incident commander. There can only be one incident commander for any given situation, right? They're a source of authority and approval. So the communications group has its own lead, for managing its own subgroup. But it's important to remember that all of their activities roll up to the IC, and the IC has final say over what happens during an incident. That's a fair number of responders, right? But remember, this group is orchestrating a company-wide shift in operation. I think there's a lot of nuance and a lot of detail to what happens next. And the exact steps of what happens in these phases will differ from company to company. But at a high level, I'll describe how the process basically works. So phase one is entering into emergency operations mode, right? This is where you alert internal employees if catastrophe is currently happening. right? And you do this to make sure that, when you have folks that are out in the field doing demos, they're aware that they may not work and they know how to work around them, right? Or anybody that's having a customer conversation, so they're equipped with knowing what to say. Maybe you have folks at a trade show or an event, right? Make them aware of what's happening. Right, and basically the goal here is to make sure that folks know there's currently an ongoing problem and provide them with useful details about what's happening. This is where you shut down all outbound marketing campaigns, right? And so this includes any sort of paid outreach that you may have going. Right? During a technical outage, what you don't want to do is tell prospects how amazing your product is, only to have them reach your target landing page and have that experience fall short due to an outage. Right? So all promotional outreach should temporarily be halted until normal operations resume. That also goes for scheduled content, right? This includes things like paid social posts or blog posts or any type of content that's intended to bring you traffic that you might not have otherwise had. Right? Again, the goal here is to be mindful of the new user experience and that this is the worst time to attract new users, right, when your product isn't working. And then, right, we talked about the role of the social officer, right? This is when you really kick that into high gear, right? So that's phase one, right? These are the things that we do to go from normal operations into emergency mode. And then we get into phase two, right? This is where we start focusing on proactive messaging. So the normal things you're doing during an incident, the normal Twitter and status page updates that would occur should still occur, right? Those things should still be happening. But there's an additional level of proactive messaging that should occur with your strategic customers, with media, with analysts, with your internal employees, right? With all of your additional stakeholders. And so the communications operations group is, in the communications incident, singularly focused on communicating with all necessary parties as soon as possible. And what they say depends on where in the incident life cycle a catastrophe was declared, right? Again, remember those phases. Incidents aren't always well understood at the start. So when exactly a catastrophe, you realize you're in a catastrophe scenario, that might be slightly different, but generally speaking, the communications group will issue a statement during each one of these incident life cycle checkpoints. So the first life cycle checkpoint is the investigation phase, right? We know there's a problem. We're unsure of the source, but don't worry, we're looking into it. Next is the identification phase, right? Whenever from the technical side, you realize we've identified what we believe to be the problem, right? We've also identified what we think is a remediation, but we're still working on it. The incident may not be resolved for a while, so hang tight, stand by for more updates. And then there's the resolution phase, right? We've deployed a fix, we think it's fixed, we continue to monitor the situation, and we ensured, yep, it didn't occur, so this incident is now officially resolved. And I should note, right, that for each of these three phases, the communications incident group may communicate differently with different stakeholders in different ways. So for example, right, company-wide, you may get a detailed one-to-many message, like an email that goes to a company-wide alias, right? For strategic customers and partners, right, you might do something a little more personalized, like a personalized one-to-one type email that has quite a bit of detail in it about what's happening. You might also send out a general email, like a one-to-many type thing, where you reach out to any of the distribution lists that you have with a generic email about what's happening, right? It doesn't include a whole lot of detail, and that might be distributed to all of your customers and contacts. So the exact method for what you do in these phases should follow your corporate communications guidelines. And our incident response guide provides some examples of how that might work as a starter recommendation, right? If maybe those guidelines aren't fully in place, or as some examples of things you might do. So that's it, right? Like once we get to resolution, everything is over, right? We should be done. That is the official end of the technical incident. But at this point, there's still a lot left to do, right? This is at the point, like when you resolve this, you need to resume all of those normal company operations that were shut down, and that can take a significant amount of time. But there are also a couple of things left for the communications group to do. So after the incident is resolved and after a resolution message is sent, the communications team still has some additional responsibility. The technical team, will be reassembling later to prepare a proper post-mortem, but, that might take a couple of days, depending on the incident, right, and how severe it was. So between the time that the incident is resolved and the time that that post-mortem is published, you'll still have a lot of customers asking questions. So the communications team prepares what we call a preliminary analysis to brief, customer-facing teams on what to say during customer conversations that occur before that post-mortem is published. So you should be really careful here, right? What you don't want to do is put together your own post-mortem, right? And you don't want to share details that might change when the actual post-mortem process occurs. So the goal in this preliminary analysis is more or less to cover things like how to recognize symptoms of this issue, right? In case it reoccurs, here's how you work around it if it does, and here's who you should contact if these issues persist, right? In other words, you're basically saying, hang tight while we figure out everything that happened, but in the meantime, here's what you do if it happens again. That preliminary analysis should be available and distributed, within hours of the incident being resolved. And so what I'll say is this at this point, right? There is a lot more that happens, and a lot of that is outlined in the response plan guide. For example, right, like once a postmortem is complete and published, there are recommendations in the guide for how your sales and senior leadership team can take steps to earning back some of that eroded customer trust. But this is a 1-hour webinar, and we're already starting to run towards the top of the hour. So this is basically a high-level introduction to what is a very lengthy and explicit process for managing crisis communications during a technical catastrophe. So this webinar just gives you that high-level look, but there's a much richer level of detail around each of these considerations that I've outlined today. So to start wrapping it up, let's do a couple things. One, first, I want to address some frequently asked questions before we get into some of your questions today. So whenever I talk about this, I get a couple of things. One, the first question I almost always hear is, why is this a parallel process that is happening outside of the technical incident? And the short answer here is that during a technical catastrophe, what we want to do is we want to interfere with the technical response as little as possible, right? During a technical catastrophe, what you don't want to do is add additional burden to your technical responders, right? You don't want to add additional burden or confusion in that call either. What you want is for your technical team to stay as focused as they can on resolving that technical issue and solving the catastrophe. In fact, what you want to do is you want to give them less to worry about when the stakes are so high. I love this one, right? I'll get this, like, are you telling me that our CEO should be on call? And the answer to that is yes, like 100%, absolutely. I mean, the fact is, like, they more or less already are on call when a catastrophe like this occurs. And all we're doing is formalizing that response process, right? Again, this should be a very rare event. They should not be getting paged once a week. Additionally, what this act does of putting them on call is this gives you a chance to do some formalized training in advance so that they know what the response process is, their role, and we can start setting expectations of how this is going to go down well in advance, right? Instead of figuring all of that out ad hoc in a moment of crisis, right? You can do that when the stakes are not so high. And this goes not just with your CEO, right, but with several critical roles across the company and several roles in senior leadership teams. Are there other types of crisis communications incidents? And yes, the answer to that is absolutely, right? And so here's a good takeaway, right? Both this webinar and the response framework guide focus specifically on a technical incident response process, right? And having a technical catastrophe and how your communications around that catastrophe occur. And we have focused on the technical scenario because I think it's a pretty obvious place to start, right? It's a scenario that already has or should have a structured emergency response process in your organization, right? You already know and understand how some of that works. And based on those experiences, it's then it's lower friction to socialize this and even practice this process and how it would work, because this is a common threat scenario that everybody can understand. But I think what happens is, once your marketing and communications and executive teams practice these patterns and see them in play, you'll very quickly see other places that this type of response is warranted and improved by having a formalized response plan and on-call responders. And then finally, what I'd like to end on is sharing a couple of tips for getting started, because I think one of the harder parts about this process is a couple of things. One, these incidents are pretty rare, right? And so there may not be a sense of urgency around doing these things when you start. And two, when you start tackling this project, I think there tend to be a lot of open-ended questions around ownership and responsibilities and how you get folks to buy in. So here are some things to think about when diving in to figure out your own response process. A couple of considerations, right? One, what are the exact thresholds that constitute a catastrophe, right? What does that mean? You have to, as a company, agree that these are the thresholds that matter, and you won't necessarily get it right away. But again, right, these are things that you can iterate and improve on. I think there's a good starting definition in this deck, but the more explicit you can be about those conditions so that everybody understands when the scenario has occurred, the better a process you'll have. So another consideration, right? The difference is in procedure between normal mode and emergency mode, right? So what are the differences in those? When you figure out what types of activities need to be shut down or altered, when you go through that process, that may determine other responder roles that you need to create or have procedures for. And I'll say this, right? Even the example of shutting down all outbound marketing campaigns, that might be 15 different people in your organization today. But do you need to have all 15 of them respond? I think this is an interesting case because what happens is you start to realize that there are controls that may not be shared or manual processes that are manual today that can be automated. And you should work towards that state and have, one primary responder responsible for a wide variety of tasks. So that's an important thing to work through ahead of time and start figuring out what you need to do to make that happen. 3, are there boilerplate things that we can say in these situations, and can we template those ahead of time? And I think this is a really good communications exercise. I think, in a moment of crisis, again, as much calm as we bring to this chaos, we tend to be amped up, and there are a number of things that we go through. So whatever you can do ahead of time to template some of your response, go ahead and do, right? There are boilerplate things you can say, or greetings that you can compose, or, folks, like reach out to these folks if you have questions. What you can't do is you can't really template the details of a technical incident and what's gone wrong, but there's a lot more that you can, right? So think about your messaging guidelines and try to do that in advance. The procedure for gaining consensus and authorization, I just sort of glossed over that when we talked about that approval layer. But I think it needs to be very explicit. Who does what in which order? What are the expectations? And how do you get to a point where you're okay with letting messages go? And then also, right, how often will you practice this response procedure? These response procedures are no good unless everyone knows what to do, right? So you need to practice them, you need to socialize them. And when you're working out the kinks and you're kind of building up to deploying this process, doing something like a weekly or a bi-weekly check-in is good to make sure you get to a good working point. But then after that, right, it's not set and done. You should practice it, at least quarterly or, in some regular cadence. So that's a lot of material. It's a lot of meat to throw out there, I think, in one webinar. So let's breathe for a moment and let that all in. So where do we go from here, right? So to recap, I think you need a solid technical incident response process, right? ICS is great for that. That's step 1. Step 2 is once you have that, a very next logical step is to create communications response plan around technical catastrophes. Turns out ICS is really great for that too. And then 3, right, once you do that, you can start looking at other crisis communications incidents that you might be able to manage using that same framework. So that's way more than we could ever possibly cover in 1 hour. So here are some additional resources to help you do these things. So the PagerDuty Ops Guides, that is a definitive collection of all types of guides that we have like this. The Incident Response Guide is there. I didn't even talk about postmortems today, really, but if you want a step-by-step guide for structuring a blameless postmortem and how those things should work, there's a guide for that as well. The Communications Incident Response Guide that I've been referencing is a little bit delayed. You should see it posted in Ops Guide in July. But between now and then, if you have questions, please reach out to me directly. I would love to talk to you. I'd love to maybe even show you a preview of what we have and get your thoughts, because I would love that sort of feedback. So with that, we'll go ahead and start Q&A. I know we've run a little bit long, but yeah, I'll leave the slide up while we do that.
Great. Thanks, George. That was awesome. In particular, the command side of this, I think, is very interesting. Not losing sight of, just being in the weeds and responding to the technical issues, but also having that holistic point of view and make sure that you don't lose sight of that. Now, just quickly before we do the questions, this webinar is recorded, so make sure you share it with your peers, because as George said, there's a lot of information here, and these guides are going to be critical to help you communicate to your organization. And I'll do the Amazon giveaway here also right after we get through questions, but I do want to address one big question that I have in particular. I'm going to pull moderator seniority here, which is, you can consume the guide from a very technical or tactical perspective. How do organizations go from guide to communicating and assigning these roles if they haven't already built this system? And who usually drives that?
Well, I'll tell you, I think it's a lot of preparation and a lot of planning, and you have to ask some difficult questions. And so the unfortunate answer of what I've seen today is usually you will realize that you need this once it's too late, right? Once you've already been through a major catastrophe like this and you realize that the response was lacking. So typically in that scenario, I think it only takes one for most companies to realize that that's the case. And you need an executive sponsor to really create time for this and push it through. And to also, give you the leeway to work with a cross-functional set of teams, get their buy-in and create some space for this. But that's the unfortunate reality of what I see, right? Once you experience the pain, then you tend to go for it.
Yeah, so part of the response of catastrophic incident 0 is to make a plan for the next one.
Exactly.
That's interesting. The other thing that you brought up was the preliminary analysis, and how do organizations decide what to share of that analysis, when to share it, and is it only for the catastrophic SEV1 incidents?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? And so again, what you don't want to do is you want to create space for a proper postmortem, right? And so what you don't want to do is share technical details or the takes on what you think happened. You don't want to get into territory where the postmortem, things that the postmortem would usually cover. And so in order to not quite step on that turf, what you need to do is really just affect the concerns and the questions that people have in that meantime before they get answers. And usually, again, it's focusing on, hey, here's the issue that occurred. Here's how you know if it's affecting you. Here's a workaround, right? If it's a problem, here's exactly what you do or who to call, right? And you give customers a path of action. And generally, I think they're okay with that. Now, is that appropriate just for catastrophes? I think what happens is, once you practice some of these things, you'll see that there are useful tools in here, not just the preliminary analysis, but some of the other ways that you communicate with customers that could be beneficial in any outage scenario. Some of these things are a bigger lift than others. And so I think what I've seen is that, over time, what's going to happen is you're going to recognize there are other things that could work for you in different scenarios, and you'll adopt some of these processes into your typical, less catastrophic response scenarios. But I think that happens, once these types of responses become second nature.
Mm-hmm.
You feel pretty comfortable with them.
Right. Right. And, along those lines, and related to what you share, I thought it was very interesting how you talked about, like, stop communicating your standard message. It doesn't matter right now. What matters right now is how you communicate what's going on. Do you see organizations, does that ever really end, or do you see organizations, I've seen a few times where they respond in a way where they have a very elaborate blog post on, hey, we messed up, this is what we did wrong, this is how we're going to resolve it, where they over a longer period of time start to roll it into kind of a marketing process for longer lived communication, I guess, as a part of the response. Is that becoming more and more common?
I think what happens when we see response, I don't know, can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I was gonna. I don't want to say the company's name,
Okay.
but they had a major outage, and it wasn't until like 2 weeks later that there was some marketing material, blog posts that came out that were very
Ah,
detailed on what happened, and they got a really great feedback from that. And I'm wondering, is that a continuing trend where these responses kind of bleed into a larger communication effort?
yeah, absolutely. And so there are a couple of things there. One, we believe in publishing postmortems with details around what happened in incidents, what
Mm-hmm.
we've learned, how these things will be mitigated in the future. I think for larger incidents, a response like a blog post makes a lot of sense. You want to get very detailed, and again, provide a degree of transparency around the things that you can share. And it should be. It's difficult for some organizations to be 100% transparent, right? But like, shoot for the 90s somewhere, right? Is my advice. Be
Yeah.
as clear as you can be about the things that you've learned, and I think that is a trend that we've seen is very beneficial, right? When I talked about customer trust being eroded, the more that you can do to answer customer questions and let them know what happened and be frank and give them an opportunity to ask questions and interact, I think customers understand that failures happen and that these things will occur. But the more human you can be about your response and just own it
Right.
and be clear, I think that is one of the primary things you can do to make sure that that customer trust isn't gone forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. It's not just the technical issue that you've resolved, it's also kind of a relationship and a respect you're building with your customers and your users. Well, George,
Absolutely.
thanks for your time. This material is fantastic. I think in conjunction with the guides, make sure everybody who attended share the recording, share the links to the guides, and comprehensively, this is a great way for you to get started in building this system out for your organization. Now I'm going to go ahead and announce the 3 Amazon gift card giveaways. And for those who won, you will be getting an email shortly after the webinar notifying you how to obtain that. So the first winner is Anudri E. The second winner is Justin T. And the third winner is Martin S. So congratulations to those winners. Thank you everybody for attending the webinar today, and look forward to the recording link to share out to your team. And George, thank you very much, and I look forward to the future guides that you come out with, because they're very, very strong.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.